Welcome back to Psychology 101 Introduction to Psych, and I mentioned we were going to talk about the psychoanalysts at the end of the last video, where we talked about Mesmer and William James and Wilhelm Wundt. So you go to the beginnings of psychology as a science, and here's where you have the split, right? You have those who are interested in introspection and the workings of the mind, and then you'll have the other part of the split, which are the behaviorists, which we'll get to when we get done with all of the psychoanalysts. So I believe I talked about hypnotism and Freud in the last lecture. And when it came to the psychoanalysts, I was going to go out of chronological order. So this is where things are going to get a little wonky in the readings, is because I'm not going to follow chronological order so much as there's going to be a reason why I'm going to be jumping around from here until we get to the more contemporary, what would you say, the more modern psychology, or the more modern, what would you say, the more modern takes on psychology, approaches to psychology, where we get into more of the neurology of things and all of that. But we're going to talk about Carl Jung and analytical psychology. So, while yes, chronologically Freud comes before Jung, again, Jung went deeper into the depths of the human mind than Freud went. So there's a saying that Freud found the basement of the human psyche, and Jung found all these separate layers underneath the basement. So you could say they're sub-basements, or they're the caverns and the caves of beyond the basement of the human unconscious. That's one way of thinking about that. And so we're going to talk about Carl Jung today. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and medical doctor and psychoanalyst. He was born in 1875, died in 1961. He was born in, I'm going to probably butcher a lot of these places' names, but he was born in Kessel, Switzerland. His father, Paul, was a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, and his mother suffered from intermittent depression. I believe we would call that seasonal affective disorder, where people tend to be more prone to depressive mood episodes in the fall and winter months and have more experiences of positive emotion in the spring and summer months. It has to do with vitamin D deficiency. And initially, Jung wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become a pastor himself, and like many others in his family. However, he also aspired to study archaeology because he had an interest in the history of humans. But ultimately, he decided to go on and study psychiatry and medicine and become one of the greatest thinkers in psychology, and really bridge the gap between religion and science, or at least attempted to in many ways. And that's kind of, well, we'll talk about that when we get into the split from Freud. So during Jung's formative years, Freud and Jung would actually influence each other intellectually. Um, it was the book Psychopathia Sexualis that influenced Jung to start studying psychiatry while he was in university. It was written by a psychologist by the name of Richard von Krafft-Ebing. So Jung would complete his degree in 1900 and begin his internship at the Berkeley Hospital under the supervision of another psychiatrist by the name of Eugen Bleuler. And Bleuler actually asked Jung to write a review of Freud's interpretation of dreams. So in 1900, psychology as a science was still considered in its infancy, but Jung had become a qualified proponent of Freud's method of psychoanalysis, especially after reading the interpretation of dreams and writing his review of it. He was 30 when he sent a copy of his studies in word association to Freud in Vienna in 1906. And the following year, the two would meet in person for the first time. So the word association method is pretty interesting. I've used it myself in group and individual therapy in my time working in the psychiatric hospital. So basically, what you have is you have a list of 100 words, and some of the words are phrases. And basically what you do is you ask the client to say the first thing that comes to mind when they hear the word. It works best if you have two people, like a co-therapist, especially in group, because someone can sit there and time the latency between the time you say the word and they give their first word that comes to their mind, as well, looking for affective changes. So it's, oh, well, I said this word, you said this in response, but you actually had this affect. What's going on with that? Can we take a look at that? And then invites the client to kind of discuss why this word may have had an effect on them. Now, in the group context, what I would do is I would pick out 10 to 12 words of this list of 100 words, and we'd just go around the room and ask them to say the first word that came to mind, and we would discuss how people associated things. So if I said head and someone said tail, someone said hand, well, the word head could be associated with two sides of a coin, or it could be associated with parts of the body. Somebody might associate head and mind or head and brain. So some people kind of really, it's all, and it's basically an analysis of how they associate things and how they think and how they categorize things. So that's kind of what that's all about, and that's how you use that in the therapeutic context. So Freud also would need collaborators and pupils to validate and spread his ideas. And Berglioz was a renowned psychiatric clinic in Zurich, Switzerland at the time, and Jung's research had already gained him international recognition, especially when he published diagnostic association studies and later sent a copy of this book to Freud, who had already bought a copy. Now, preceded by lively correspondence, meaning that Freud and Jung were sending letters and stuff back to each other all the time. They would first meet in 1907 in Vienna. In 1908, Jung became an editor of the newly founded Yearbook for the Psychoanalytical and Psychopathological Research magazines. So psychopathology is the study of mental disorders, psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thought is a therapeutic modality. So in 1909, Jung traveled with Freud to see a Hungarian psychoanalyst by the name of Sandor Frenzy to the United States for a conference at Clark University there in Worcester, Massachusetts. The conference at Clark was planned by psychologist G. Stanley Hall, which included 27 distinguished psychiatrists, neurologists, and psychologists. So again, psychology was in its infancy. And we'll get into something kind of interesting that I thought about here. Okay, so when we think about psychotherapy or we think about psychoanalysis, we tend to think of psychologists and professional counselors as the main providers of mental health treatment and therapy. Now, in the 1890s, 1900s, when psychoanalysis was taking off, psychiatry was they weren't medical. They were medical doctors, but they mental disorders weren't medicalized at that point, if that makes sense. So your psychotherapeutic providers were primarily psychiatrists. What I think happened, and I'll have to look into this further before I can say this is a definite, but this is a hypothesis I have, is that as mental disorders got medicalized, and especially around the 1950s, 1960s, when Thorazine was introduced as a treatment for psychotic disorders, lithium was used to treat bipolar disorder, which was called manic depressive at the time. While psychiatrists being medical doctors, they had to become prescribers. And what happens is, well, what I think happened, I guess, is that as the psychiatrist got pigeonholed into a prescriber role, the psychotherapeutic enterprise had to be delegated to other disciplines. And so the clinical psychologists were the first discipline to kind of take over the psychotherapeutic enterprise. And then as deinstitutionalization in the 60s, 70s, and the 1980s, many people were needing psychotherapy, and so it had to be delegated even further down. So this is where clinical social work and professional counseling kind of took over the psychotherapeutic enterprise in a sense. So why is that important? Oh, well, it's important because, at this conference at Clark University in 1909, you have psychiatrists, neurologists, and psychologists. And I think at that time, these were the three disciplines that were dealing with psychoanalysis and providing psychotherapeutic services in the psychiatric world, psychiatric hospitals, and even in private practice to a degree. Now, this represented a watershed moment for the acceptance of psychoanalytic therapy or psychoanalytic thought and psychoanalysis in North America. This forged a welcome links between Jung and influential Americans. So in 1910, Freud proposed that Jung should be in the position of lifetime president of the newly formed International Psychoanalytic Association. However, after forceful objections from his Vienna colleagues, it was agreed that Jung would be elected to serve just a 2-year term in office. Now here's where they diverge. So Jung worked on this book called The Psychology of the Unconscious, a study of transformations and the symbolisms of the libido. Thank God it was republished under a more simple term called Symbols of Transformation, which is an incredibly interesting book. I just recently finished it last year, and it's a very incredibly difficult read to get through, but it's definitely worth it if you're into Jungian psychology or Jungian thought. And it was because of this book that tensions became pronounced and manifested between him and Freud due to their various disagreements, including those considering the nature of the libido. So libido, life energy, according to Freud, that's where your sexual instincts come from, is the libido. Jung was more convinced that the libido is more just a general life energy itself, and that sexual misadventure wasn't necessarily what caused mental disorder. For Jung, it was more things being out of balance in the individual unconscious, the collective unconscious, which we'll get into that section when we get there, and just general maladjustment to life itself is what caused neurosis, hysteria, and the other mental disorder names at the time, whereas Freud was just, sex was the end all be all to everything. And so, because Jung was not entirely convinced of this, and he focused more on the collective unconscious, which is the part of the unconscious that contains what they call universal memories and ideas that we inherit from our ancestors, that the tension between Freud and Jung came so much that they split apart. Jung left the all the psychoanalytic associations that he was part of and just kind of completely broke away from that. And his way of analysis became the foundation for analytical psychology, which now is its own thing. So in 1912, these tensions came to a head because Jung felt severely slighted after Freud visited a colleague there named Ludwig Binswanger. And we'll talk about Binswanger a little bit more when we get into the existentialists. Like I said, I'm going to go a little all over the place with this, right? Because you have Jung and Freud and other psychoanalysts that played a big role in the psychoanalytic movement. Then you have the behaviorists coming in and try to say, well, the inside of the mind's all a bunch of BS and woo-woo, and all it is environmental factors affecting your behavior that make you do the things that you do, both adjusted and maladjusted, and that this unconscious has nothing to do with that at all. Of course, there's a moment where the cognitivists and cognitive psychologists come in and say, well, hold on a minute, there's some thinking that goes along in that. So they have an answer to the behaviorists, and then the existentialists and the humanists kind of have their say in response to the behaviors as well. Binswanger would be considered an existential psychoanalyst. So he gets thrown into the existential school with Frankl and Rollo May and Irvin Yalom, and of course you have the humanists like Carl Rogers, who took a more phenomenological view of the human being. And so Binswanger was an existential psychoanalyst, and he was a colleague of Jung's and a colleague of Freud's. And because he went and saw Binswanger in Cruiselin, which again I probably butchering the hell out of these names, which, whatever. That seeing Binswanger and not coming to see Jung kind of left a bad taste in Jung's mouth, and so they kind of split completely. So shortly after that, Jung traveled to the U.S. and gave a set of lectures at Fordham University, which were published later as Psychology of the Unconscious, a study in the transformations and symbolisms, which again, thank God that they republished this as just symbols of transformation. Again, great book. I highly recommend you read it. It gives you a good introduction into Jung's ideas of, dream symbols of transformation that he Jung is very complicated to understand. So let's look at it this way. So Jung put these lectures together and then published them in this book, Symbols of Transformation, where he talked about the analysis of dreams of clients that he was seeing in the hospital and their overarching archetypical themes that he was able to pull out of the dream material, relate it back to the dreamer or the client, and these images within the dreams were what would you say, motivated the individual transformations for things to get better, something like that. And in this book, there are some remarks on Jung dissenting from Freud on the view of the libido. And this book and his set of lectures represented largely a psychoanalytical Jung, or what I would call Jungian psychoanalysis or Jungian analysis, and not so much the theory of analytical psychology for which he became famous for in the following decades. Nonetheless, it was this publication that, according to Jung, cost me my friendship with Freud. So it was this book was like it was the axe blade between the two of them. And of course, there was the differing view of the concept of the unconscious, because Freud thought of the unconscious as just the repertoire of repressed memory, and Jung thought it went way deeper than that, which we can explain Jung's concept of the unconscious, and then when we get to the lecture on Freud, we'll talk about Freud's view of the unconscious, and we'll try to compare and contrast the two across these two lectures. And it's going to be the best way to do that. So, Jung saw Freud's theory of the unconscious as incomplete and unnecessarily negative and inelastic. And according to Jung, Freud conceived the unconscious solely as a repository of repressed emotions, desires, and memories. However, it was Jung that observed an overlap to some extent with Freud's model of the unconscious, specifically with what Jung called the personal unconscious. So he was willing to say, okay, Freud got this part of the unconscious right. This is the personal unconscious. Freud got that correct. However, there was more to it than just that, which there was this second overarching form of unconsciousness beyond the personal. And he named that the psychoid, which was a term he borrowed from someone named Dresch, but with a somewhat altered meaning. And this is where it gets into the collective unconscious, which is not so much, I would say, a geographical location, but a deduction from the alleged ubiquity of archetypes over space and time. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is there are primordial images and symbols that hold meaning for us and have always held meaning for us across time. And that would be like the wise king, the tyrannical father, there's the great mother, the terrible mother, the hero, the adversary, there's the shadow. So all of these different images that we hold in our collective, meaning across. If you look cross-culturally, there will be hero stories, there will be these myths with heroes, and they're always fighting an adversary, and they're always going against the terrible monsters of Mother Nature. And so it's these cross-cultural, cross-human experience things that are, what would you say, constant across those. Those are what make them archetypal. And they're part of our collective unconscious. And so in November of 1912, Jung and Freud met in Munich for a meeting among prominent colleagues to discuss psychoanalytical journals. And I talk about a neo-psychoanalytic and what would you say? A new psychoanalytic theory on Amenhotep the Fourth. Jung expressed his views on how it related to actual conflicts in the psychology movement, while Jung spoke Freudly, supposedly suddenly fainted, and Jung had to carry him to a couch. So we're going to get into analytical psychology. That's what they call this model. I call it Jungian psychoanalysis. That's just my personal view, and I'm not saying that I'm right or I'm wrong. I mean, I don't know if it's just the way that my mind understands it. I mean, I've been known to piss off people in both the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic camps. One of my supervisors when I worked at Central State, the great Dr. Singer, I'm gonna give him a shout out there. He's a psychodynamic therapist, and I would say that, well, aren't they the same thing? They just have different words. And it's like, okay, you're gonna piss a lot of psychoanalysts off and a lot of psychodynamic therapists off. I'm like, okay, well, why does it make people mad? And say, well, to him and his point of view was that psychoanalysts tend to sit there and will listen to somebody talk for about a year before they start to try to help them with their problem, whereas a psychodynamic therapist will be right there in the therapy at that time and try to help them immediately. So for Dr. Singer, it boils down to, do you think the problem can be solved in years, or do you think it can be solved in months? And that's the difference between a psychoanalyst and a psychodynamic therapist. Even though they all borrow from the same theorists and the same clinicians, they all borrow from Freud, they borrow from Jung, they borrow from Klein, they borrow from Binswanger and Boss. So, for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to say that psychodynamic, psychoanalytic stuff, it's the same. It's the same thing. It's just time frame as far as the therapy is concerned is a little bit different. So in analytical psychology or Jungian psychoanalysis, among the widely used concepts owed specifically to this are the anima, the animus, the archetypes and collective unconscious, complexes, extroversion, introversion, individuation, the self, the shadow, and synchronicity. And I will do my best to try to explain all of these components to the best of my ability. Now, according to Jung, and this is going to mirror Abraham Maslow with his hierarchy of needs, right? So at the top of the hierarchy of needs for Maslow is self-actualization. Maslow, I think, may have borrowed this from Jung, even unconsciously, because Jung said the overarching aim in life, according to him in his psychology, is the fullest possible actualization of the self through individuation. So the individuation process is the process of self-actualization. So for Jung, the idea was to bring all of your unconscious elements into your own conscious awareness and then sort them out and integrate them in a way that's going to work for you and other people. And central to this process is the continual encounter with the elements of the psyche and bringing them into the unconscious. So we'll talk about all of that as we go through this. So again, the individuation process is the process of self-actualization. So for all of my humanists out there who are followers of Maslow, there's not that much difference between Jung and Maslow, as anyone might try to contend. So essential to the process of merging the individual's consciousness with the collective unconscious through a huge range of symbols and by bringing conscious awareness to bear on what the unconscious, and such elements can be integrated with consciousness as a surface. So there's a lot to unpack in that. So basically, as you start to try to integrate your unconscious aspects of yourself into your own awareness, you might start to have dreams, especially if you're high in trait openness. You'll have these dreams where you're going to have these symbols kind of make themselves known in the visual aspects of the dream. And through working with a Jungian analyst, they'll help you figure out. You got to figure out what those symbols mean to you, and how they relate to you, and where you're at in your life, and what you're trying to accomplish, and bring that into your own awareness so that you can do something about that. In effect, a famous dictum by Jung himself: the self, like the unconscious, is a priori. It's existent out of which the ego evolves. It is an unconscious prefiguration of the ego. For it is not I who creates myself, but rather I happen to myself. As with anything with Jung, it's rarely ever self-evident. So Jungian psychotherapy aims to assist an individual establish a healthy relationship with their unconscious that is neither excessively out of balance in relation to it, as in neurosis, a state that can result in depression, anxiety, and personality disorders, nor is it so flooded by it that it risks psychosis resulting in a mental breakdown or psychiatric decompensation or a psychotic break from reality. So the idea is that as you start to look at how you affect other people in the world around you and kind of take responsibility for that, you're basically trying to put yourself in order, in balance. Because, this idea of sanity is being in your head. I think Jung was kind of pointing at that. That's not the case, that you are not in your head. It's sanity is best defined as the balance between you and yourself in relationship to other people. So, one method that Jung applied to his patients was between 1913 and 1916 was called active imagination. It's where basically it's not structured. It's an unstructured meditation that allows you to kind of just let your imagination run wild. And that allows random images and symbolism to come from the mind and bring it into your awareness, and then you can talk about like what the symbols mean in relationship to you in your life and try to see what your mind's trying to tell you so that you can put it in order. That's one way of doing that. I just had the computer freeze and do something really stupid there. Where was I? Oh yeah, we were talking about individuation, active imagination, and I've never done that with any of my clients. I can't say that I've ever done it with myself, but again, as I've read Jung's work, I've thought about things that have happened in my life and patterns of things that I've engaged in and try to, I guess, assess how that has affected other people around me and try to get myself together. So we're going to talk about the key concept of the collective unconscious, right? So Jung's concept of the collective unconscious has often been misunderstood as it's related to Jungian archetypes. Okay. So in the 1916 essay of the structure of the unconscious, this distinguishes between the personal Freudian unconscious filled with fantasies, sexual and otherwise, and repressed images, and the collective unconscious encompassing the soul of humanity. So from Jung's point of view, the collective unconscious is the images of like the great mother, the terrible mother, the wise and benevolent father, the tyrannical king, the hero, the adversary and shadow being, you could kind of interchange the two and they would kind of mean the same thing. The animus and anima. So the best way to explain that, because when I say like, okay, so when men have an anima, that's the feminine the feminine aspect of the personality is represented in dreams by a female. And so in dreams, when you have a female guide guiding you through your dream, she's like almost like a representation of the wise old man. It's the wise old woman. It's the female equivalent to Merlin. And she leads you through the journey of your unconscious mind in your dreams. Archetypically has been represented in story. So if you've read Dante's Inferno, Dante's anima and animus are guiding archetypes within the visions of when he was mapping hell, purgatory, and paradise. So he was guided by Virgil, who acted as the archetype of the wise old man that guided him through the levels of hell and explained what each circle represented, but he was motivated forward in search of Beatrice, his beloved. That was his anima. She was the animating spirit that motivated him to go through and map these layers of the underworld out. Now, if you've played the video game of the same name, Beatrice is the damsel in distress. It's her spirit that Dante goes to rescue. That's the animating spirit of the quest. That's what's motivating him to go through the 9 circles of hell and to face these monsters and demons and things in the inferno. And so that's what the anima represents, as animating spirit. But there's one other way we could look at the collective unconscious, and it's not so much in the mind, but more of a social substrate made up of the collective social behaviors that, by imitation, meaning imitated from parents, siblings, teachers, and other people. So we talk about the archetype of the great mother and the terrible mother. So that's one archetype with its shadow side. So you have the benevolent mother who's nurturing and kind and provides, and then there's the terrible mother, that's the dark side of nature, that's tornadoes, hurricanes, disease, and the things that have been trying to kill us. But when you think of how do you act out what it means to be a mother, like especially for women that have children, well, you think about like the attitudes and behaviors that your mother, that she learned from her mother, that learned from her mother, that learned from her mother, across all the ages of time. So what you could think of as the archetype of mother is the pattern of mothers across time, if you take all of the metaphysics away from it. So that's what I mean by a social substrate of behaviors that we imitate and act out. So everyone acts out an archetype at one point or another. We all act out all sorts of archetypes throughout our lives. That's one way of thinking about that. The persona. This is probably one of my favorite ones to try to explain, especially in the clinical context. So, according to Jung's theory, which is not necessarily linked to any particular theory of social structure, the persona appears as a consciously created personality or identity fashioned out of part of the collective psyche through socialization, acculturation, and experience. So basically what the persona is, it's a mask that you wear that reflects a part of yourself as well as reflects what people are looking to see in you reflected back at them in that. So Jung would apply this term explicitly because in Latin it means both personality and the masks worn by Roman actors in the classical period, expressive of individual roles played. So Jung would argue that this mask is for the collective psyche. It pretends individuality, so both self and others believe that in the identity, even if it was no more than a well-played role through which the collective psyche is expressed. So Jung regarded the persona mask as a complicated system which mediates between the individual consciousness and the social community, and it's a compromise between the individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. So you can think of it this way, right? So I'm me. I'm in my house right now, but I'm also trying to put on the mask of a teacher or a professor, right? Because this is YouTube. I'm trying to teach you guys about Jungian concepts. And you probably have this ideal in your mind that you would project on me of what I should be as a professor or as a teacher. And I'm trying to reflect that back to you guys and how I present myself here on YouTube. And if it's a genuine persona, that means that there's going to be parts of myself that are real that you're going to see out behind that. So it's kind of clear in a sense. It's almost like, the genuine persona that someone wears it's a reflection of the person and what society hopes to see in them. And it is that compromise and they work together. So that's how that is supposed to be. Now, people who are narcissistic, who tend to use confidence in place of genuine confidence, what they're going to do is they're just going to wear a mask and hope to Christ that it is a genuine, it's not even genuine, but it is purely a reflection of what society wants to see. So there's no real person behind that. It's just a mask. It's just a role. And narcissists typically tend to get away with it for the short term, but in the medium to long term, people tend to figure out that this person is playing nothing more than a role. There's no genuine person behind that. And so that's what the narcissistic individual is described as within the Jungian psychoanalytic lens, is that a narcissist is all persona and maybe a superinflated ego as a defense mechanism against the wounded and shrunken self. That's very vulnerable and cannot handle being vulnerable. And so we can talk a little bit about that, right? So I read this paper about, oh God, had it been either somewhere between 2022 and 2023. It's a brilliant, brilliant paper, and you can find it on Google Scholar. It talks about aggression in psychopaths and narcissists. You can type that in there and it'll get you to the paper. But basically, it makes the case that when people who are psychopathic, and I believe it talks about the dark triads, we're not talking about personality disorder, antisocial personality, or narcissistic personality disorder, and we're talking about subclinical psychopathy and narcissism, right? So they have definitions. Delroy Pohlhaus did a really good job of defining these. So Pohlhaus's definition of a psychopath is someone who's a impulsive predatory parasite, and narcissists are disagreeable extroverts who will substitute competence with confidence. Now, the psychopathic people who tend to be physically aggressive, they do that when their self is in danger, meaning that they will engage in self-defense. So somebody has to be physically aggressive to them before they become physically aggressive back. But narcissists, on the other hand, they engage in what's called ego defense. So anytime the ego is wounded, then they become physically aggressive. Because what happens is the ego is so overinflated because it's like an armor that is there to protect a very vulnerable, wounded self, and so the ego kind of overinflates like a suit of armor, and over top the ego is, of course, the persona. And if somebody attacks the self, then or the ego, then they're more likely to become physically aggressive. So I had this client that I worked with for 3 years had narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and schizoaffective disorder, and his psychotic presentation was mostly paranoid. And he respected people who were truthful because of the paranoia. Now, he had a history of violence going back since the 90s, and he even was violent when I started working with him. But to give you an idea of what ego defense looks like, so this particular client always liked to sit with his feet propped up. And there was a younger client who came in and basically pulled the plastic table that my client uses a footrest out from under him. And so my client stood up and said, "What's up? What's up?" And then they got into a fist fight. In fact, they had a series of 3 fist fights. My client was the instigator in all 3, and this was all because the perceived slight of "how dare you take my footrest from me." So the disrespect associated with moving the footrest was a hit to my client's ego, which motivated physical aggression and motivated him to fight this guy that's 30 years younger than him. He had 3 different fist fights, and in one of our therapy sessions, I said, let's just be truthful about this. You're in your 50s. How many more times are you going to get into fist fights with people that are a hell of a lot younger than you? And like, let's just tell the truth about this. No disrespect, but you're not a spring chicken anymore, bud. How many more fist fights do you think you can handle before someone really seriously hurts you? And we sat there, we had, a good 10 minutes of silence because my client had never heard anybody talk to him that way. And he said, Sullivan, you're right. I can't keep doing this because I am going to get hurt because, yeah, these cats are significantly younger than me, and I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I'm not as fast, and I'm not as tough as I used to be. I think he got into one more fight after that, and he's like, well, yeah, I'm an old man, but that's why I just have to try to hit somebody really hard just once. Yeah, but if you can't put them down after that one hit, then what? Well, then it's, we're off to the Royal Rumble, and that's not good for anyone. But that's what ego defense looks like in a narcissistic individual. So I talked a little bit about the animus, anima, and all that. So Jung identified the anima as being the unconscious feminine component of men and the animus as the unconscious masculine component in women. Jung considered, for instance, an animus of the anima in men in his work Ion, which is a very incredibly difficult book to read and understand. I had to read it a couple of times to get it, and it's just incredibly terrifying how brilliant he was at recognizing patterns. And Jung said, yes, if a man realizes the animus of his anima, then the animus is a substitute for the old wise man. You see, his ego is in relation to the unconscious, and the female figure, the anima, personifies the unconscious. But in the unconscious is also a masculine figure, the wise old man. And that figure is the connection with the anima as her animus because she is a woman. So one could say that the wise old man is in the same position as the animus to the anima. So that would be like Merlin and Maeve from the old Celtic myths. Then you have Merlin, who is the animus, and then you have Maeve, who is the anima. And that's in some variations of Celtic mythology, because it depends on if you're looking at Irish, Scottish, Welsh, or English, because they're all Celts in that area. And I'm not as well versed in my mythology, separating all those things out, so unfortunately, I can't really parse that out any better this go around than I probably did the last time I tried to walk through this. Now, Jung stated that the anima and animus act as guides to the unconscious unified self. I kind of talked a little bit about that in dreams, especially where if men dream and they're being guided by a female figure in the dream. And that forming an awareness and a connection with that anima or animus is one of the most difficult and rewarding steps in psychological growth. Jung reported that he identified his anima as she spoke to him unexpectedly as an inner voice one day. This was during the times of his active imagination periods and we'll talk about where he wrote the Red books. Now, in cases where the anima or animus complexes are ignored, they vie for attention through projection onto others. And this explains, according to Jung, why we sometimes immediately are attracted to certain strangers. We see our anima or animus in them. They call it love at first sight. Moreover, people who strongly identify with their gender role, such as a man who acts aggressively and never cries, has not actively engaged or recognized their own anima within them. So, love at first sight. This is I think what happens with a lot of relationships is that when you fall head and over heels in love with someone, what you fall in love with is actually a projection of your own ideal, your own anima on that person. If you're a dude, if you're a female, you're projecting your animus onto that guy that you find yourself immediately attracted to. And what we hope is, and this is what I've told my clients when they've asked about relationship things, because it's like, well, why am I not feeling as in love with this person? It's like, well, first, what's happening is that anima or animus projection is wearing off. So as that projection fades, now you're face to face with the genuine person that you've decided you're going to be with. This is when you have to actually put in the work to make the relationship work. One of the things I've asked people, or people have asked me about, like, well, how has your marriage worked out for so long? It's like, well, marriage is a constant state of conversation and negotiation. Because for me and my wife, our projections have all worn off, so now we're stuck with one another because we've vowed that we're going to make this thing work for the rest of our lives. And that's a constant state of conversation and negotiation, listening to each other, tell each other what we want and what we need, and actively working to make that happen for each other. And that's what you do after the projections wear off. The other thing I always would get asked by my clients is, well, how do I get the woman that's or the man that's right for me? And I'm like, that's the wrong bloody question. What you need to ask is, how can you make yourself into the partner somebody could want? At first there'd be some resistance to that sort of thing because it's like, what are you trying to say, that there's something wrong with me? It's like, well, if you're getting rejected by all the potential partners, then it's not all the potential partners that are wrong there. It's obviously there's something wrong with you that you need to fix. And you can go on here on YouTube and look for, Jordan Peterson talks about the same thing. Like, well, what is it that a partner could want? How about someone clean, someone honest, someone generous, someone who works hard, someone who's willing to negotiate, someone who's willing to listen? All of those things are what a potential partner could want. So get yourself together so that somebody would want to be with someone like you, and go from there and see what happens. And Jung attributed human rational thought to male nature. At the same time, the irrational aspects were considered being natural for females. Rational being defined as involving judgment, irrational being defined as involving perceptions. So women are more perceptive, or men are more judgmental and using judgment to make decisions. Consequently, irrational moods are the progenies of the anima shadow, and irrational opinions of the female anima shadow. And I'm not here to be offensive, let's say, but this kind of goes back to, and this is a criticism that Jordan Peterson has had, right? And I'm bringing him up because, one, he's an intellectual influence on me, and two, he is, a contemporary Jungian analyst and Jungian psychologist, and he knows these concepts better than most, and he communicates them a hell of a lot better than I do. And I'm fully willing to admit that, but he's talked about masculine order and feminine chaos. And that's not males and females. It has nothing to do with sexism. It's just how we've represented these things based on the world that we live in. Because our ancestors lived in a world of males and females, masculine, feminine, order and chaos, the known and the unknown. Why is the feminine associated with the unknown? Well, this is just my interpretation of it, right? And I think it's because women ultimately give birth to infants, and in the world of our ancestors, they didn't have sonograms, they didn't have modern technology to where they would know the sex of the child while the child was still in utero. That was just not a thing that happened back then. That's just an objective fact. It's a historical fact. There's no inference into that, right? And because the feminine is associated with the vessel of the unknown, which would be the potentiality of a newborn child, it was only until the child was born that you knew the sex of the child. And so that's potential, that's the unknown. That's why the cauldron is a symbol of femininity in paganism, even the new agers, right? When they talk about masculine and feminine energies within the new age circles, it's symbols of masculinity and femininity, that wands and swords are considered masculine symbols. Earth, water, and even the cauldron, because the cauldron is supposed to be symbolic of the womb, are feminine symbols. And so that's just the world that human beings lived in over thousands of years ago, and those same symbolic representations are still relevant today as they were thousands of years ago, and there's no, what would you say, rabble-rousing is going to change that. The archetypes. Now we're getting into the meat of this stuff, right? So the archetypes. The use of psychological archetypes was advanced by Jung in 1919. And within his framework, the archetypes are innate, universal prototypes or ideas that may be used to interpret observations, a group of memories, or associated with an archetype as a complex. Mother complex associated with mother archetype. Jung treated the archetypes as psychological organs analogous to physical ones, and that they are both morphologically given that arose through evolution. This is the So here's another split between Jung and Freud. Freud thought of the Oedipal mother as the mother who, what would you say, provoked desire in her young son because of the Oedipus Rex play and Jude having relations with his mother. Jung thought of it as no, while yes, the mother is overprotective, but it's more of a devouring archetype. It's like the cave in the Hiawatha myth. It's the witch and Hansel and Gretel. So I had this other client. See, this I can bring these things out if I've had the clinical experience to bring these things out, right? So okay, I had this client who had overprotective parents. So he came from a pathologized Oedipal family situation. He is in his 20s. He's got all these problems like you wouldn't believe. And mom basically overprotected him. He was the oldest child of two, so he had a superior complex about that because he was the oldest. He had autism spectrum disorder, but he was very high on the high functioning scale. Has cerebral palsy, so his body is nowhere near where his mind is, and so that incongruence has caused him a lot of emotional distress and a lot of problems. And because of the physical disability, mom basically overprotected him and coddled him and treated him like a child so that in any time that my client would try to express any desire for self-sufficiency and independence, they would stamp it out and say, but you can't do that because you're not capable because you have physical limitations. And of course, that would cause a lot of underlying anger issues because there is a desire to put his own being out in the world and couldn't do it. And so my thinking is, okay, well, what happens when you have children? Well, they're incredibly dependent on you for the first couple of years of their life, especially the first 9 months. They are absolutely 100% dependent on their mothers all the time. By the time they get about 2 to 3 years old, they're toddlers. They're able to walk about, walk about, crawl about, run about, and play with other children. And because they can go out and play with other children, you can take them to the playground. You can put some distance between yourself and your child. They get to have a little bit of independence and be able to engage in exploratory behaviors with the world at large and other people. But in the Oedipal mother, that doesn't happen because, well, because when as little Timmy gets more independent, so does mom get some of her independence back. But when you have a child with limitations, they're more dependent, so mom doesn't get that independence back. And so what I think happens is there's this unconscious desire to take any spirit of independence away from the kid out of spite because whatever independence they thought they were going to get around the ages of 2 or 3, that's just not going to happen. So they devour this. That's why it's the devouring mother archetype. It's I'm going to devour your spirit of independence and any sense of ability to do that, to take revenge on you because I couldn't get that back after I raised you for 2 years. So that's kind of how like a person can unconsciously identify with the Oedipal devouring mother, terrible mother archetype. And archetypes are collective as well as individual and can grow on their own and present themselves in a variety of different creative ways. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which was Jung's autobiography, he stated that he began to see and talk to a manifestation of his own anima and that she taught him how to interpret dreams. And as soon as he could do this on his own, she ceased talking to him because she was no longer needed. So she was a guiding spirit, archetypical representation of his exploration into the symbols of his dreams and symbols of his own unconscious. That's one way of thinking about that. Jungian archetypes are defined as universal, archaic symbols and images that derive from the collective unconscious. As we mature, the archetypal plan unfolds through a program sequence, which Jung called the stages of life. And each stage of life is mediated through a new set of archetypal imperatives that seek fulfillment in actions. They may include being parented, initiation, courtship, marriage, and even preparing for one's own death. The shadow. This is the one that I think I can explain the easiest. It's an unconscious complex defined as the repressed, suppressed, and disowned qualities of the conscious self. And according to Jung, the human being deals with the reality of the shadow in four ways: through denial, projection, integration, and/or transmutation. I read this book a while back. I forget what the hell it was called, but it has something to do with it was a collection of works edited, and it was all about the shadow. And the way it was explained, and I really like this, was that you could define the shadow as this imaginary duffel bag that you drag behind you, and anything that you find about yourself you don't like, you can just toss it and drag it behind you. So it's out of your conscious awareness. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. So people with personality disorders, they tend to deny that they are a problem. So they deny their own shadow. They disown their bad qualities, think they're the best people in the world. They're not the problem. The problem is other people. That's how they see that. So that's how they deny their own shadow. Projection. I have a coworker that I don't necessarily care too much for, and I would say that it's mutual. This person doesn't care for me either. And we are the antithesis to one another. So for me, I try to be a very careful, thoughtful, competent clinician, which was my role. I worked as a treatment team psychology associate. So you have to be very careful in that position. Where this person's position was primarily focused on discharge. And fair enough, you have a job to do, and I may not like how you do it, and so you come across as very, what would you say, rash, hurried, what would you say, incautious, and it comes across as just incompetent as hell. Because I'm in the business of doing things right, and you're just in the business of doing things, and those aren't the same thing. And so I have those tendencies myself, and I don't care much for them. And so I would say part of our personality conflict was unconscious projections of our own shadows onto one another. And then there's integration and or transmutation, and this is kind of goes back to one of the things I learned from listening to Jordan Peterson and reading his work and taking my own time to read about the atrocities in Nazi Germany is that we all have the capability to be horrible people like that. So when you study Nazi Germany, let's not talk about the victims. We hear a lot about the victims of the Holocaust, but if we think about the perpetrators, they're human beings just like you, just like me, and under the right circumstances could under the right circumstances that could present themselves, we are just as capable of falling into doing some of the same horrible things that they did, because that's what human beings are like. We're capable of wonderful, miraculous things, but we're also capable of very horrible, atrocious things, and we have to be very aware of that. And if you say, well, no, I could never do that, according to Jung, you would be part of the problem because you have no conscious awareness of what you were actually like. So according to Jungian psychoanalysis or analytical psychology, a person's shadow may have both constructive and destructive aspects. In its more destructive aspects, the shadow can represent aspects of oneself that people just will not accept. In its more constructive aspects, the person's shadow may represent hidden positive qualities. This has been referred to as the gold in the shadow. So this client that came from the Oedipal situation that I talked to you about learned a bunch of very awful antisocial aggressive behaviors as a means of coping with being in that type of environment. So and my client's shadow is a very kind and decent, understanding person who's empathetic, but would hide that away because felt he had to put out this persona of being this aggressive, basically a dick, for lack of better words. It was just an absolute dick. And there was no reason for that. It's like, here you are, you're in this situation, you're on your way out, and you're still engaging in these sorts of behaviors. What I'd like to know is, where is this supposed good person who's kind and compassionate, empathetic? Where is this person? Because you're hiding them. That's your shadow, and you need to bring that back into awareness and integrate it into yourself. Because otherwise, you're going to find yourself coming back to the hospital after you get discharged. So if that's not what you want to do, then you need to bring that good part of you out. And so, like Jung, with this client, I emphasize the importance of being aware of that shadow material and incorporating into the conscious awareness so that we can avoid projecting those qualities on others, or projecting our own worst qualities. And I probably could have done a better job when it came to my coworker that I didn't get along well with, and realized that what I was doing when I was, because it takes two to tango, and I'm willing to take responsibility for my part in projecting that onto that former colleague of mine. So again, psychological types. Yeah, I'm rolling my eyes at this because part of my training is with my master's in forensic psych is more of the objective science. So what you're seeing to this side here is Myers-Briggs psychological types. You've got the INGF, ENJF, INTJ. So basically, it's these psychological types that Jung developed laid the foundations for what we call personality psychology. And there's different psychological types or temperaments. You have extrovert and introvert, which we know what that means. It's people who like being the center of attention versus people who prefer to be alone. And according to Jung, the psyche is an apparatus for adaptation and orientation, comprising several distinct psychic functions. Among these, he distinguished sensation, intuition, perception, thinking, and feeling. Now, when you think of the Myers-Briggs test and you're looking at reliability and validity from a psychometric standpoint, your more reliable um, temperaments or functions is going to be introvert versus extrovert. Why is that? Well, extroversion is one of the big five traits, and it's associated with sociability and positive emotion. And that's relatively stable across time, so it's more reliable on test retest, and it's actually more valid as a construct. Introversion is withdrawal, right? So that's one of the facets of neuroticism from the big five. So introversion you can think of as neuroticism from the big five. Extroversion is also one of the big five traits, but intuition, perception, thinking, and feeling, those are more subjective, and they're going to, depending on the day and your mood, you could identify with any of those. So there's no real reliable test, retest dimensions along those four psychological types. So from a pop psych standpoint, it might be fun to take. Some professional counselors use it. I'm not a big fan of it just because, I have that objective science training. So I tend to gear more toward the big five when it comes to personality tests and personality metrics, for lack of better words. Now, some innovations of Jungian analysis. So it is a method to access, experience, and integrate unconscious material into the awareness, and is a search for the meaning of behaviors, feelings, and events. Many are the channels to extend the knowledge of the self. Dream analysis is one important avenue that you could do that. Others may include expressing feelings through art, poetry, and other forms of creative expression, examining the conflicts and repeating patterns in one's life. So that would be part of that introspection into how we affect ourselves and other people. So a comprehensive description of the process of dream interpretation is pretty damn complicated and complex, and it's highly specific to the person who undertakes it. It relies on the associations that a particular dream symbol may suggest to a dreamer, at which times may be deemed archetypal insofar as they're commonly understood to be shared by many people throughout history. Examples could include a hero, an elderly person's, situations involving pursuit, or even falling. Those are all archetypical symbols that are experienced by many, many different people across time that manifest themselves in dreams that we might ask about. I believe in the lecture that I did in 2020 about this, I talked about this client that I worked with. This was before I moved up to the psychology department. He was a veteran with Survivor's Guild, and he had this recurring nightmare of being drained by a large camel spider. And the spider represented the shadow. And I said, okay, there's something there in the unconscious that's eating away at you. And he had difficulty talking to the therapist there at the hospital, and for some reason was able to talk to me. Probably because I wasn't a clinician. I was just sitting on the floor, so I wasn't part of that whole clinical world. And talked about how him and his buddies in his platoon, they all went to school together and they all got blown up and died, and he survived. And that guilt just ate in him because he was an intelligence officer, and he thought it was his responsibility because he was supposed to know that that bomb, that IED, was there in the road, which wasn't. And we talked about that. And as we talked about that, and I used, basic cognitive behavioral therapy about, like, do you have any evidence that it's your fault, or is this just what you think? That he was able to talk through that and realize that it wasn't his fault logically. There was no way he could have known, and the nightmares stopped. And so that might be an example of maybe not an archetypical dream, but the spider is an archetypical symbol that made itself known in his dream. Whereas Freudian psychoanalysis relies entirely on the development of the transference in analysis, to the analyst, Jung initially used the transference and later concentrated more on a dialectical approach to this symbol and archetypical material presented in the patient. Moreover, this attitude toward patients departed from what was observed in Freud's method. So Freud would sit away from his client be on the couch, and he would just write down and let his client just say whatever came to mind, and he would only ask about things. Jung was a face-to-face guy, and so this was what you would find in the Gestalt therapist, the humanist um, therapists, or person-centered therapists, they call it. Even the existentialist it's a face-to-face talking thing, and so Jung was in the therapy as much as the client was in therapy, which is a major departure from what Freud did. And Jung's initial formulations arose mainly out of his own creative illness. They were also a conscious reaction to the stereotype of the classical Freudian analyst, sitting silently and aloof behind a couch, occasionally giving out interpretations while remaining totally uninvolved in the patient's guilt, anguish, or the need for reassurance and support. Instead, Jung offered a radical proposal that analysis is a dialectical procedure. It's a two-way exchange between two people who are equally involved. Although it was considered revolutionary when he first suggested it, this model has influenced psychotherapists from all the other schools, although many seem not to realize, or they don't want to give Jung the credit for that one. Jung's Red Book, we talked about this a little bit in the earlier slides. So when he was 38 in 1913, Jung experienced a horrible confrontation with his own unconscious. He saw visions, heard voices, and worried that he was having a psychotic episode, but decided nonetheless it was a valuable experience, and in private he would engage in active imagination and try to give these images time to come out and express it. He would record everything he felt in these small journals, and he transcribed it into a large leather-bound book, which he worked on for 16 years, and it is the Red Book. I have a copy. I haven't read it yet, so hopefully by the next time I do this lecture again, I will have a chance to read the Red Book, and I can actually hopefully give some decent commentary on it, because Jung is one of my, what would you say, one of my intellectual heroes, and I've read a lot of Jung's work. Because when I first caught on to Jordan Peterson, I didn't take anything that Jordan said at face value. I went and decided to do the background reading, and well, I got sucked into Jung's work, and so that's why I'm able to do this lecture on Jung and hopefully do it pretty well. I mean, it was one of my highest I had more comments on my Jung lecture when I did the initial set of lectures in 2020, and here it's almost 6 years later, and so I'd be interested to know if this has gotten any better or any worse in that time, because I haven't really given a lecture like this in some time. Jung's thought was formed by early family influences on which the maternal side were a blend of interest in the occult and in a solid reformed academic theology. On his father's side, there were two important figures. His grandfather was a physician academic named Carl Jung, only with a K, and the family's actual connection to Lotte Kestner, the niece of a German polymath named Goethe. And Goethe was considered, I think he was a relative of the same Goethe that wrote Faust, because that was one of Jung's favorite books growing up was Faust, and I think he thought he was related to Goethe. Although he's a practicing clinician and writer and such, he founded analytical psychology, and much of his life work was spent exploring related areas including physics, vitalism, Eastern and Western philosophy, alchemy, astrology, sociology, literature, and the arts. And Jung's interest in those and in spiritual subjects led many to view him as a mystic, although he preferred to be seen as a man of science. So one of the criticisms I got when I was in my counseling program when I first went in 2020 was that Jung was a wizard. And I thought that was just absolute nonsense. And when I went back to complete my counseling degree in 24 and I had to retake the theories class, I asked the professor why they don't go so why they have it in the counseling theories book on analytical psychology, but they don't teach Jung. And admittedly, it's very hard to understand Jung's work. And how do you teach something that you can't understand? That's a fair point. And like I said, Ion is a scary book to read because Jung was able to look at astrology, alchemy, mythology, and make a lot of connections, especially when it came to Christianity and Jung's idea of Christ as an archetypical representation of the self. So I'll give you, if you want to read Ion, you should read some other books. So I would highly recommend reading Modern Man in Search of His Soul. It's a good introduction to Jung's work, or Memories, Dreams, and Reflections as a good introductory basis into Jung's work. Then read Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. That would be book 2 that I would recommend you read. Then read Psychology and Alchemy so that you can get a good foundational grasp on Jung's take on alchemy and how it relates to human psychology. Like that is a paramount requisite before you even attempt Ion, because you have to understand archetypal representations and the archetypes in the collective unconscious. You have to understand alchemy and alchemical symbols in the context of archetypical representations, because Jung thought of alchemy was the mythology that science was grounded in. It had its own mythology, and that's what alchemy was. And understanding alchemy, archetypes, and mythology is what allowed you to understand where he was analyzing Christianity, astrology, mythology, symbolism, and alchemy all together in Ion. And that's what Ion was it talked about the phenomenology of the self. So I recommend reading those books if you're going to try to really understand Jung's work. So again, it goes back to I can now understand how can you teach something if you don't understand it. At least Freud was understandable at face value. Jung, you have to really go deep to understand. That's why if you're watching this lecture and if you haven't watched any of Jordan Peterson's work, you want to understand Jung better. Jordan Peterson's 2017 Personality and Transformation lecture series, and I may link it in the end of this video. I would recommend watching that because he explains Jung through through a narrative context with The Lion King, and he lays out the archetypical representations in the movie The Lion King. It's probably one of the best Jung lectures out there, so I would highly recommend that, and I may link to that at the end of this video so that you can get hopefully I can lead you into a deeper understanding of Jung's work. So we're going to talk about Jung's later years, and then we should get to the references. And this lecture actually went over an hour. So Jung became a full professor of medical psychology, which is a precursor to clinical psychology at the University of Basel in 1943, but he resigned after a heart attack the next year and led a more private life. He became ill again in 1952. He continued to publish books until the end of his life, including Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies in 1959, which analyzed the archetypical representations and meaning and psychological significance of reported observations of UFOs in the night sky. Because Jung thought that the sky was the canvas where we would project our fantasies onto the night sky. And in 1959, that's where we were going. I guess that's at the start of the space program, the space race, the Cold War, the competition with the Soviet Union, and the UFOs were part of our archetypical imaginations of that. In '61, Jung wrote his last work. It was a contribution to a compilation called Man and His Symbols, and it was titled Approaching the Unconscious. It was published posthumously in 1964 because he died in 1961 at Kusnacht after a short illness. Yay, here's all the references, and as you'll notice, I really dove into the primary sources and read a lot of Jung's original works to bring this lecture together. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this today. The next lecture will be on Freud, and like I said, I think I'll link at the end of this video to Jordan Peterson's lecture on Carl Jung and the Lion King, which will give you a more robust understanding of Jung's ideas. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.